Today we're going to be discussing a concept in evolution called genetic equilibrium. We're going to relate to this term in a little bit in a later time, but the idea that you have to understand, in order to understand genetic equilibrium, we have to understand a term called frequency. Specifically, we're looking at an allele frequency. So frequency is going to be part over a whole. Very much your math background, hopefully that makes sense if you want to figure out a percentage of something, part over whole. Basically the same idea as frequency. And in a population, we have what is known as the gene pool. And that is going to represent all of the genes / alleles available in a population. And in a classroom, it's very hard to do this as an example with alleles due to the fact that not everybody knows their full genotype. Everybody has 2 alleles for every gene, and the people that have dominant alleles unfortunately don't know if they have 2 dominants or a dominant recessive because they would express both the dominant phenotype. So the easier way to do this in an actual class that I would use is something that has the same number of variations but is more attainable within the group. So that would be the X and Y frequency. So an X chromosome frequency within a classroom, or the classroom represents our population. So what is the frequency of the X chromosome within a population? So if our classroom had 25 students total, that's going to be important. And of those 25 students, 15 are girls, 10 are boys. So that information is important for deciding the X chromosome frequency in a classroom. Knowing that girls have 2 X chromosomes and a boy has an X and a Y, what we would do is mathematically multiply the 15 girls, since each of them brings to the table 2 X chromosomes, we'd multiply that by 2, and that would give us 30. Each boy only has 1 X chromosome, and so therefore that would be only 10 X chromosomes due to the boys in the classroom. So when you add those together, that 30 plus 10, so that brings us to 40. That's our total number of X chromosomes in this population. So I'll say that. So 40 X chromosomes. But what is our whole number? That's the total number of sex chromosomes within the population. And given that we have 15 girls and 10 boys, each of them brings to the table 2. So that's a total of 25 students in the classroom times 2, which is 50. So our frequency of X chromosomes would be 40 divided by 50, which is 80%, but in this equation we're going to put it into decimal form, or 0.80. The remaining frequency would be of the Y chromosome. So you can do math again and do all this a second time, or you can kind of use deductive reasoning in saying that if 80% or 0.80 represent the X chromosome, there's only one other variety, which is the Y chromosome, so that would have to be 0.20. And this is important because the first thing we're going to talk about in this chapter is an equation. And this equation was brought to us by 2 mathematicians, last names Hardy and Weinberg. So they were mathematicians that kind of dove a little bit into science. They didn't try and be scientists. They actually just said, we know some math about this, and we're going to help you with evolution. So Hardy Weinberg came up with this first equation, where they said if you take all the alleles in a population, and generally you have a dominant and a recessive. If you add them all together in a gene pool, they have to represent 100%. So they use their own variables, and it's a standard variable, so this is something that you're not going to change ever. But we're going to use the letter P to represent the dominant allele, and we're going to use the letter Q, and sometimes they're just recessive, so you might see lowercase p and lowercase q. That's the recessive allele. So the first equation that we're going to work with would be the example that we just did above. If you take the dominant allele, or P, in a population, and you add it to the recessive allele, then they have to equate to 100%, or in decimal form, 100% is 1.0. So that's what we did here. We said that if 80% represent the dominant allele, then 20% must represent here. You don't have to do the math. You kind of use the ability to say that since we only have 2 variables, if we figure out one variable, we can figure out the other because we know they have to equal 100%. So that's the first thing. The second equation, which I'm going to kind of type over here now, So I keep this all on one page. We now can look at a population of a gene pool based on either genotypes or phenotypes. They, in essence, are the same thing for this part of the equation. Within a population, you can have homozygous dominant individuals that would represent the two capital letters. You can have heterozygous individuals, or you can have homozygous recessive. In the end, they all have to represent 100% of the gene pool. So when you add the homozygous dominant, heterozygous, and homozygous recessive, they have to equal 1.0. To translate that into what Hardy-Weinberg did, we're going to translate that into our allele combinations. Before we do that, think of a coin flipping activity that we did, where two people each had a coin and they flipped it. The first opportunity was they both could have typed or flipped and got two heads, where the heads represent the dominant allele. That was one opportunity. Then there was an opportunity that they could have flipped. Both of them could have had recessives or tails in that situation. But the third variation, heterozygous, is not as straightforward. One person could have flipped a heads, while the other flipped a tails. But there is another opportunity where the other person, the first person that flipped the dominant, in this case, could have flipped the recessive. The other person could have flipped the dominant. In genotypic language, they are technically the same, but in terms of probability, this has a double the chance of happening because there were two chances to get the same combination of dominant A and recessive A. With these two, there is only one opportunity to get two recessives. Each person has to flip the coin at the same time, having two tails. But here, there is more variety. So to collapse these variables into a Hardy-Weinberg equation using their P's and Q's, here's what happens. The probability that two dominant alleles go together, just like in the probability of math, if two events happen at the same time, we multiply their probabilities. So what this would be is P squared. And I'm not sure if I have I do. Okay. So P squared represents the homozygous dominant individual. In a population, if you add them to the people that are heterozygous, they would represent the P and Q genotype. They have one dominant and one recessive. But since there are two opportunities, Hardy-Weinberg had to account for that. So they have a coefficient of 2 because they have two opportunities to get it. And then their dominant allele and recessive allele. So they would be PQ individuals. And then the grouping that are homozygous recessive, Q, but since there are two of them, then we're going to square them. And that's going to give us our second equation that you would need to know. Take into account all of the homozygous dominant. Sorry if I can bring this down to recessive. Let me fix this so people aren't confused. All right, that doesn't seem to be working. I probably made it worse then. All right, I made it worse, unfortunately. So P squared, there we got to start from the beginning. So P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. Or in other words, all of the homozygous dominant people, when added to the heterozygous people, when added to the homozygous recessive people, have to equate for 100% of the individuals in a population. So these two equations are very, very important. I will not tell you P and Q on a test and what they represent. You have to know they represent the dominant and recessive allele, and just knowing two equations is something that you have the opportunity and you can do. So apply this information to a word problem. So on this next page, we're going to do that. A population of hamsters has a gene consisting of 90% dominant M alleles. In this case, it's a black phenotype, 10% recessive alleles or gray. Mating is random. At this point, that doesn't mean anything. Eventually it will. In this problem, it's a very introductory problem, so they really are helping you. They pull out the data that's important. Frequency of the recessive allele is 10%. The dominant allele is 90%. Hopefully by deductive reasoning, if I said that 10% are recessive, you could have figured this out automatically. It might not even have to be there in the problem. It could have been figured out automatically. So of these two, I can erase that. Let me clear that annotation. I'll keep it there. But what we have, we're going to fill in the 5 variables. These are the 5 variables of the two equations. So look over here, and what we have is the frequency of the recessive allele. So we're going to convert that over here to a decimal form. So that means 10% is 0.10. Sorry, that decimal kind of blends in there. So 0.10 represents the recessive allele. By our Hardy-Weinberg equation, P plus Q equals 1. So if 0.10 is Q, then automatically P must be 0.90. Once you have those two variables, all the other variables will go into play very, very easily. So in my calculator, if you need it, you can plug in Q squared, which would be taking 0.10 and multiplying it by itself. What you're going to get is 0.01. Take 0.90, multiply it by itself, and you get 0.81. 2PQ, put that in your calculator. You can say that this would then be, that would be 0.18. You could have done that by also mathematical reasoning by saying if all three of these equal to 1 and two of the variables are determined, this has to be the remaining portion. So 0.81 plus 0.01 is 0.82. The remaining is 0.18. So that's another way to do it. So what I'd like you to do on the worksheet that I gave you in class, if you're actually in my class, you can start working on those problems. This is the second example. So I want you to press pause on the video and complete the first problem. Then you're going to come back and I'll explain what you did. So do that right now. Pause. All right, welcome back. What you probably did is unfortunately wrong because you have to pay attention to something very detailed. This is the data that's given. 36 plants out of 400 were dwarf. That's the recessive phenotype. So what did you most likely do? You took this 9% and plugged it right here. Maybe you made the mistake that 9% is actually 0.09. Some people have that difficulty where they just put 0.9. If you did that, we've got to fix that first. But the second thing is, this is the recessive allele. They did not give us that 9% of the population is the recessive allele. They gave us 9% is the recessive phenotype. So where does that 0.09 actually go? Where it says right here, recessive phenotype. So 0.09 goes here. So make sure to fix that problem if you did that. Likely, again, based on prior numbers, you had that unfortunate mistake. So from the 0.09, what you then can do is go backwards up to Q. Take the square root of 0.09. From there, you can then figure out P. From there, you can figure out the other two. I don't think the issue becomes where do you plug in the first number? You can plug in the first number wherever you want, and if it's wrong, unfortunately, the other calculations will all work out to that, and they'd all be wrong. So it's very important to know what did they actually give you. So for the next few problems, make sure that is something you focus on. All right? So in class the next day, we will go over all the other problems. You don't have to do the questions here, A and B. That's something we'll talk about later on. For right now, practice the idea of getting the 5 variables. And we'll see you tomorrow.